Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's debate. My name is Grace and I am the chairman, and Yanuli is the timekeeper. The adjudicator is Miss Coote, and the topic of the debate is that you cannot legislate against fake news. The affirmative team seated to my right is from St. Peter's Girls, and the negative team seated to my left is from Glenunga International High School. The speaking time for this debate is 6 minutes. A single warning bell will sound 1 minute before the speaking time, and a double bell will sound at the speaking time. A continuous bell may be rung 30 seconds after the speaking time, in which case the speaker must sit down immediately. Please ensure that your mobile phones and other electronic devices are switched off. As I declare this debate open and call upon the first affirmative speaker, Izzy.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Izzy, and I am the first speaker for the affirmative team. The topic for tonight's debate is that you cannot legislate against fake news. We see the topic to mean that laws cannot be made against news that is false. We define legislate to mean that making and enacting of laws and fake news to be news articles and videos that are untrue to provide entertainment to the reader or watcher. As the affirmative team, we believe this statement to be true. Tonight, I'll be talking to you about the political aspects of the debate, the fact that the government has more important issues to deal with, that it is nearly impossible for it to be patrolled, and finally allowing the government or any organisation to have full control over what we see online can be recognised as censorship. Our second speaker, Aditi, will be discussing how education and understanding of fake news is essential and better than legislating against it. She will then go on to talk about how there are already websites and groups working against fake news which we as a society should support. And finally, our third speaker, Hannah, will rebut the opposition's case and sum up our team. Now to my first point, that the government has much more significant concerns to deal with. Just within Australia, there are science, immigration, social, healthcare, economic and criminal issues, just to name a few. There are problems that directly affect the public. For example, gay marriage in Australia is a problem that directly affects the happiness of the public. The prime job of any good leader is to keep its people happy. Although Australia is dealing with this problem, other countries are not. Fake news is not the number one priority if people in other countries cannot express who they are and live a life for joy, says Dan Grayville, a political expert. This is just one of the many issues that come before the one of fake news. Patrick Terrell, another political person, says dealing with fake news, a form of entertainment that does not openly affect individuals when their concerns, such as terrorism, is completely ludicrous. Fake news can wait until the global issues have been dealt with. Fake news is an unimportant issue. Why would the government put time into such issue when there are clearly other things to deal with? This leads me on to my second point. Like all worldwide concerns, policing fake news is merely impossible. The internet is a very large place where people from many countries around the world put up fake news. In order to patrol this, governments from many countries will have to firstly agree to patrol and secondly take down all the fake news articles and websites that are already out there, says Mark Campbell, an expert in solving of global issues. From there, governments will have to stop the public from creating and posting new fake news stories. It has been proven that it is highly difficult to stop websites, images and videos, etc., from going up on the internet. For instance, online movie and streaming websites such as Putlocker or Watch Series are in fact illegal. However, this does not stop individuals from watching or downloading TV shows and or movies. The government has failed to block/stop these websites due to the stopping websites being merely impossible. According to a 2015 study in the US, only 17% of mediums on the internet get shut down per year. That means that 83% stay up and intact. Converting this knowledge, around 17% of fake news would be successfully shut down per year. From evidence, it is clear that policing fake news is basically impossible and impractical. Finally, allowing the government to have complete control of fake news is censorship. According to the Oxford Dictionary, the definition of censorship is the prohibition of any parts of books, films, news, etc. that are considered politically unacceptable or a threat to security. Legislating against fake news is prohibiting it and therefore, by definition, can be known as censorship. James Macro, expert in Australian history, said legislating against fake news is bringing back censorship. This will create a bad name for Australia and create a world that we do not want to be a part of. It is clear that legislating against fake news is censorship, and bringing censorship back to the world will not cause any good. So, in conclusion, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, with the points I have highlighted, it's extremely clear that you cannot legislate against fake news. There are more important issues for the government to focus on. Policing it is virtually impossible, and allowing one organisation to have complete control over fake news is censorship. Thank you.
I call upon the first negative speaker, Anita Supra.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Madam Chairman, the topic of our debate tonight is that you cannot legislate against fake news, and we as a negative team believe that this statement is false. But before we get started, we would first of all like to acknowledge the affirmative team's definition for tonight's debate, and that we agree with the statement. However, I would like to first of all point out some flaws in the first speaker's points. She has stated that fake news is unimportant as opposed to other things that may be happening around the world. However,
Unless you believe that child sex rings and illegal trades aren't important, it would be worth knowing that in 2016, it was believed that Hillary Clinton was running an organized child sex ring in the basement of a pizza shop. And of course, this is false. But someone saw this and decided to pay the pizza shop a visit with a loaded gun. As you can see the detrimental results that fake news has created, it is very important that fake news is legislated against and that it is possible. Another thing I would like to point out is that she has also stated that legislating against fake news would lead the path to censorship. However, under human rights law, extreme restrictions such as the ones mentioned above on freedom of opinion and expression cannot be allowed. But why is that when people hear legislation, they immediately think of extreme measures of action in the form of punishment and censorships? Using legislation and regulation in a much broader perspective to support and create an enabling environment in which opinions, information can circulate and where there can be scrutiny about the quality of their information. Nobody's voice is being silenced. The freedom of expression and speech is in no danger. As the first speaker, I'll be talking to you about how legislation against fake news is feasible by enforcing a law on mandatory ratings of websites' credibility and enforcing a law in collaboration with governments and leading social media companies, such as Facebook and Twitter. Our second speaker, Negar, will be talking about how legislation against fake news is possible by having a compulsory course in all government schools for children to distinguish between fake news and real news, as well as rewarding those who publish true facts and practice proper journalism through subsidies and other government-based rewards. Our third speaker, Tommy, will rebut and sum up our team's case. To my first point, you can legislate against fake news by enforcing a law on mandatory ratings of each website, so audiences are aware of how reliable a source could be. As the internet exponentially grows into the future, discrimination is going to always be present due to the lack of security and verified fact-checking, as well as the fact that the internet can also be anonymous. According to a survey conducted in December 2016 by the Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C., only 39% of American adults felt very confident that they were able to distinguish between fake and real news. A solution to improve people's abilities to distinguish between different things has been shown to work through legislation itself. In this case, through a mandatory system of labels for each indexed website and its content under governmental and company agreements. This is similar to how all food products are required to have a nutrition label on them, according to the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act of 1990. Governments can firstly start by funding and supporting ratings and security checks of websites by slowly implementing a system like this, then legislating it. An example of a system like this has proven to be effective, as is the development of AI by the West Virginia University, where members of the computer science team are teaming up with Reed College to create a fake news detecting system through text analysis. According to Catherine Liu, a product manager at DataVisor, a fraud detection, AI can detect the semantic meaning behind a web story by analyzing the headline, subject, geolocation, and main body text through learning natural language processing. We are aware that this will not entirely eliminate fake news, given that internet data on the internet is endless. However, legislation against websites and stories that are considered fake news has proven effective, and that legislation around mandatory security checks and website ratings would be a highly effective strategy among many to combat this issue. To my second point, you can legislate against fake news to prevent people in a society from harm by collaborating with leading social media companies to eliminate fake news. As approximately 2.1 million posts are reposted on the internet each time from fake news, according to Craig Smith, a renowned journalist, social media has increasingly played a major role in the spread of fake news. If social media sites were so powerful, social networking companies have the power to minimize the amount of fake news that circulates the internet as well, through proper government regulations in each country. Governments can work collaboratively with websites such as Facebook by enforcing laws to increase security checks. An example of collaboration that has already started to take place is with Facebook, as Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, stated in December 2016 in a Facebook post that Facebook is planning to decrease the creation and spread of fake news through collaboration with government-led campaigns after Germany threatened to fine Facebook 50 million euros in May 2017. If Facebook had not taken down false content in Germany due to its law of punishment of fake news. We agree that Germany's law of punishment and imposing fines is not effective and unlikely to work in reality. Facebook and Germany could have collaborated together to take down content. We may be able to even see this in the future. In conclusion, we can safely say that legislation against fake news is definitely possible through legislation of a fact-checking system as well as legislation of alliances between social networking companies and governments. By installing such a system, we take one step further in ensuring the trust across media. Furthermore, collaborations between leading social media companies can definitely build a stronger alliance between the two powers. Ensuring journalists are writing facts through regulation is definitely possible. Thank you.
I call upon the second affirmative speaker, Aditi Tamanka.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for our debate is that you cannot legislate against fake news. We, the affirmative team, believe that this statement is utterly true. Before I introduce my points, I would like to point out some key flaws in the opposition's argument. The first speaker tried to tell you that all citizens have freedom of speech, but then contradicted herself by saying websites will face mandatory rating settings to see if they are appropriate and correct and not fake news. However, if people really did have freedom of speech, then what they were saying and their opinions would not be taken down by the government or verified. According to the UN Rapporteur Charter for Freedom of Speech, the human right to impart information is not limited to comfortable statements. The right also protects information that is not always correct. The right to freedom of speech is something we pride ourselves on as a nation. So ultimately, it begs the question, is it morally ethical to deem a statement wrong or fake news? Can we define something as simply inaccurate? Or is legislation and mandatory rating system too generic for something as complicated as news? Now, on to my team's points. Our first speaker has already explained how priorities of the government do not align with the legislation, how fake news will be near impossible to police, and how allowing the government to legislate permits a form of censorship that strips away our freedom of speech. Today, I will be talking to you about how legislation against fake news provides a detrimental effect on society, which is why an organic method of education is a far superior option. I will then explain how supporting groups who are already fighting against fake news is significantly more effective than legislation. Now, on to my first point. Education and an overall understanding of how to avoid fake news is an ultimately better option for the safety of our citizens when compared to the method of legislation. This stands for one predominant reason. Education encourages awareness of the situation. The BBC recently conducted a survey on random British citizens to see if they could identify fake news from real news headlines. The corporation found that it was virtually implausible to detract the real news from the fake. This led Times Higher Education to sourcing research that proved although some media sites circulate false stories, the real problem lies in that ordinary members of the public fail to have digital critical literacy skills. In this day and age, a long-term and effective solution towards fighting fake news is members of the public developing these digital skills through secondary and tertiary schooling, rather than being dependent solely on the information one is fed. These interpretation skills ensure that everyone has the ability to evaluate and authenticate information, so that even if they come in contact with fake news, it is impossible they are manipulated by it. Whereas, with the legislating technique, if some form of fake news escapes the legislation, it is likely our members of public will be misinformed. This proves education is better than legislation. As Times Higher Education states, blaming technology alone implies a rather credulous population with little knowledge of how media works, and the real solution is to combat the growth of fake news is ensuring our public are educated. Now, to my second point. There are existing groups that work to prevent fake news, such as PolitiFact. We should support their efforts instead of blatantly disregarding them and turning towards regulating a legislation. This would be fairer not only to corporations who verify news, but the general public. PolitiFact and similar companies are significantly more effective and considerate than enforcing a legislation, because they have the ability to look at all news pieces and come to an individual, unbiased conclusion, rather than a legislation which blankets all types of inaccurate news into a uniform umbrella consequence. Instigating a legislation may have some benefits, but it will not be as effective as websites like PolitiFact that directly shut down fake news. They work to fact-check claims and verify all forms of news, whether that be speeches, articles, or social media posts. A legislation simply cannot cover all forms of inaccurate news, and as our team previously stated, this makes it near impossible to police. So why should we decide to legislate against fake news when there are already more specific and effective groups working against it already out there? So, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, ultimately we have made it clear that we cannot legislate against fake news, and that it is, in fact, redundant and ineffective. Thank you.
Just, Chairperson, wait until I nod at you before starting next. Thank you.
call upon the second negative speaker, Nagabai.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Chairman. As you know, the topic for tonight's debate is that you cannot legislate against fake news, a statement that we, as the negative team, do not support. Before I get to my points, I would just like to point out some flaws in the opposition. The opposition has tried to tell you that education in schools is required, and this is 100% true. We agree with this. However, for this to be accessible to a wide array of students and to everyone, it must be enacted through the curriculum, and this requires a framework achieved through legislation. I will be discussing more in my points. She has also said how we must be supporting groups that are already fighting against fake news, giving Politico as an example. For those behind the made-up stories, the ability to share them wildly on social media means a slice of the advertising revenue that comes from clicks as people follow the links to their webpage. For example, in a small town in Macedonia, according to Richard Gray from the BBC, in a small town in Macedonia where young people go using it as a get-rich scheme, paying Politico to disregard their posts and reaping the rewards of huge number of visits to their website. This isn't exactly a perfect model to base our society's freedom of expression and press on. Previously, our first speaker talked to you about how we can legislate against fake news through a partnership with leading social media companies and having a mandatory system of ratings for websites. Tonight, I will be discussing how fake news can be legislated with the education of society and digital literacy skills, so our future generation is capable of understanding the challenges of fake news. My second point will focus legislation through targeted subsidies towards quality, investigative journalism. To my first point, we evaluate stories not simply on plausibility, but on a complex mixture of past experience and our own beliefs. Skills that aren't intuitive, but are learned. And now, more than ever, teaching critical evaluation and the difference between fiction and truth is important, as it underpins the foundation of a functioning democratic society. This is exactly the type of legislation government officials can pass to make sure that the infrastructure of our democracy is being strengthened through education at the individual level from an early age. If you understand all the elements of fake news, then you can also understand how to counteract at the individual level and try to strengthen these individuals to look for the truth. But this cannot come out of thin air. It requires an infrastructure framework, and this can be done through legislation. The term fake news has called into attention the need for media literacy like nothing ever has before. We live in the 21st century, ladies and gentlemen. Digital media literacy has become one of the key necessities of our era we live in now. And a 2016 study at Stanford University shows that we aren't equipping our kids, our future generation, to the extent we need to. The study found that overall, young people's abilities about the information on the internet can be summed up in one word: bleak. If nothing else, we have an incentive and the means for implementing legislation to educate our children on digital literacy skills. Already, lawmakers are proving that this can be accomplished. The California lawmaker Bill Dodd introduced legislation in 2017 to require the state to add lessons on how to distinguish between fake news and real news to grade 7 to 12 curriculum. So, ladies and gentlemen, under this type of legislation, we can be assured that thousands of students will be capable of facing fake news online as we enter an age where media plays a major factor in our lives. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to further our argument of how fake news can be clearly legislated against. Indeed, this can be done through the relatively simple concept of awarding government subsidies and incentives towards quality, investigative, fact-checked journalism, rather than simply throwing money at large corporations. This legislation means that, economically, a portion of government funds would go towards not providing quality journalism, but also independent platforms of media, such as the Hong Kong Free Press, which is an independent and not-for-profit online newspaper created in 2015. The simple reason for such legislation is that, whilst fake news may truly never go away, as democracies, We, working with the government, can challenge society to ensure high standards of stories by quality journalists, and the platforms they appear on are the highest quality through funding. Whilst there is the argument that this isn't directly against fake news, the premise behind it is that by providing funds for good journalism, it directly takes away the power of fake news to play havoc with people's perceptions of reality. Simply put, if legislation through budgets was enacted to fund quality journalism against the fake news epidemic, society would be better off. Initiatives such as these have already been taken. At a debate at the World Press Free Day in 2017, Maurits Schacht, a Dutch politician, stated his minister at the regional level spent €500,000 to invest in investigative journalism, to strengthen this independent voice. It can be done, ladies and gentlemen. It's just a matter of when. So, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, those who have an ambition to implement control over people, to feed certain propaganda, an environment where there is no anchors to give people something to hold on to, these kind of people flourish. As we enter a world where eliminating all fake news is close to impossible, legislation can be used in a much broader perspective through digital literacy education and subsidies to support and create an enabling environment in which opinions and information can circulate, and that there can be scrutiny about the quality of this information. Thank you.
I call upon the third affirmative speaker, Hannah Brown.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Hannah, and tonight I'll be firstly rebutting negative team's arguments, making it clear to you once and for all as to why we cannot legislate against fake news. Then I will continue to summarise my own team's case. The negative team has provided you with a number of flawed arguments tonight. First of all, they stated that fake news is a very important issue and gave an example of when a pizza shop was broken into after fake news circulated about it. Yet this is a very once-off example. It's not very often that specific situations like this would occur. Although action does need to be taken against fake news, it doesn't need to be as drastic as legislation, which takes time and money. According to Caitlin McKerney, the media director of media entertainment, stated that fake news is not a prevalent issue online, and issues such as whistleblowers and defamation are much more important at the moment. The first speaker of the negative team said that legislation does not mean censorship will occur. Yet this is false, as in order to combat and abolish all fake news, it is necessary to remove what the government deems to be offensive. Fake news is a broad term. It is so generic that its definition is led by personal opinions. Thus, it is near impossible for the government to have unbiased opinions. Giving the role of legislator to our political leaders will mean, inevitably, what we see in the media is in their biased hands, which is clearly censorship, and legislation completely results in censorship. The first speaker of the negative team also stated that fake news can be legislated against through clear labelling of the sites, on media sites. Yet, this isn't technically legislating against fake news. Besides, the amount of times people click share on Facebook before checking the legitimacy or checking this labelling is very high. People aren't going to read labels. The second negative speaker said that legislation can occur through education in the school's curriculum. Yet, this needs legislation to happen. Yet, once again, legislating to change the curriculum in schools isn't actually legislating against fake news, which is what the topic is all about. They also stated that there has been technology, artificial intelligence technology, that can tell the difference between fake and real news. Yet Dr. Harrington, senior lecturer in journalism and communication, stated that this is the problem that we have, that it's only as good as the people who are making these evaluations. Do we really want to be relying on our information from a robot? This again raises the censorship issue, as artificial intelligence could be programmed to remove sites with certain political views. They also stated that corruption can occur in the already existing organisations that remove fake news websites, such as PolitiFact. Yet, if this corruption can occur simply for fake news websites to make money, then imagine what corruption would occur if this was in the hands of the government, when it isn't only money that's at stake, yet who runs the country? The second speaker also tried to tell you that legislation will educate the future generations on fake news identification. However, legislation simply hides fake news rather than actually educating a child or student about what to do if they find fake news. Tonight, my teammates have presented you with a number of very important arguments on this issue. Isabella, our first speaker, has explained how the government's priorities lie in much more important areas. She has also explained how fake news would be nearly impossible to regulate, and if it was, it can be classified as censorship. Aditi, our second speaker, has explained how education is a much more effective approach to the issue, and how there are already existing groups combating fake news that could benefit from extra funding. So, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, it is clear that we really cannot legislate against fake news. It certainly is a problem, but this impossible method of legislation is not going to solve it.
I call upon the third negative speaker, Tommy Tian.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and Madam Chairman. As we all should know by now, the topic for tonight's debate is that you cannot legislate against fake news. However, as the negative team, we strongly oppose this statement. And tonight, as your third and final speaker, I will be rebutting and summing up the team case. But before I do so, I would like to point out the flaws that was presented in the opposition's arguments tonight. The first affirmative speaker has tried to tell you that there are many more issues to deal with compared to fake news. But really, isn't fake news an issue in itself? Fake news in our society will lead to people to believe the wrong things because fake news are often sensationalized news, which aren't always true, which will later lead to civil unrest and will prevent them from and as a result of fake news, people won't get the news that they deserve. Is that the way people in our society should be treated? They do not deserve the news they get? The first affirmative speaker has also tried to tell you about how you cannot precisely draw the line and that it will lead to censorship. Ladies and gentlemen, think about this on a scale. On one end of the scale, fake news is handled through censorship and regulations. And on the other side, no one's doing anything about it. Everyone's sitting down and just waiting for fake news to happen. And what happens when these two extremes ends meet in the middle? Well, the answer is an actual solution through the empowerment of people in the form of legislation is born. Yes, we agree that legislating against fake news can lead down to a path of extreme censorship, and we agree that total government control and regulation is not the answer, puts too much of our values of freedom of expression and speech at risk. But what can you do? The answer is you can equip people with the skills through education, empower quality journalism through subsidies, etc. The second affirmative speaker has tried to tell you that education is better than legislation, and she also used a survey from the BBC. However, did the BBC survey question random citizens? And how many citizens did they question? And of which ages? Because demographics do matter. Because educating people in different demographics do matter. Offering an alternative to legislate against fake news does not mean it's impossible to legislate against fake news. It is a matter of can and cannot. Therefore, this argument is irrelevant to tonight's debate. Now, the second affirmative speaker has also tried to tell you that there are existing groups that are supporting the crackdown on fake news. Well, how people use technology is as important as its design, and that their uses depend on their understanding of the capabilities and implication of online communication. Now, altering the rules or algorithms of sites such as Facebook or policing people's use of the website won't address the fact that sharing information on Facebook is a social activity which depends on nothing but the actions and choices of the people. And this is not just referring to Facebook itself, it's referring to different social media platforms. Now, the third affirmative speaker has tried to tell you, has tried to tell you that it is impossible to legislate against fake news due to bias. Yes, it is true. We as human beings, we are not perfect. That's why there is no way we can eliminate all of the fake news. But ladies and gentlemen, I ask you this question. Does this mean that the government must not pass down any legislations at all, simply because that there is bias formed by different opinions of the people in the society? Do you expect us to sit there and just watch as fake news unleashes its consequences which are detrimental to society and slowly eating away our society? Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that taking a step towards protecting our society is much more crucial than sitting there doing nothing because we are claimed as biased. Now, also, as your third speaker tonight, I will also be summarizing our team's case. Our first speaker, Anita, has told you about how you can legislate against fake news by enforcing laws of mandatory ratings of each website, so audiences are aware of how reliable and how trustworthy a source could be. She has also told you about how you can legislate against fake news to prevent people in society from harm by collaborating with leading social media companies to eliminate fake news. Our second speaker, Nagar, has told you about how you can legislate against fake news through teaching the society and helping them to understand the challenges of fake news, which is part of literacy skills in the 21st century, where students must understand that not everything on the internet is real and authentic. She has also told you about the policies and subsidies. Instead of subsidizing corporate organizations, big media firms generically better use of this money for targeted subsidies of investigative journalism for independent platforms of media. These are instruments to permit our democracies rather than to block and restrict, because that's weak points we cannot win, but also it's detrimental to our own values. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen and Madam Chairman, we as the negative team strongly oppose the statement that you cannot legislate against fake news. Thank you.